He said she was nothing, so why is everyone suddenly asking for her name? The voice of the news anchor echoed softly from a mounted television above the bar, barely audible beneath the low hum of polite conversation and the delicate clink of crystal glasses, but it was enough to make a few heads turn, enough to stir something subtle in the air, like the first shift before a storm. The ballroom of the Langford Hotel shimmered in gold and ivory, chandeliers dripping light onto polished marble floors, the scent of expensive perfume and aged whiskey blending into a quiet symphony of wealth and performance, and at the center of it all stood Daniel Brooks, perfectly composed in a tailored black tuxedo, a man who had mastered the art of being seen, of being admired, of being believed. He laughed easily, one hand wrapped around a glass of champagne, the other resting with casual ownership at his side as he leaned into a circle of investors and acquaintances, his voice carrying just enough to be overheard without seeming intentional. "I built everything from the ground up," he said, the word smooth, practiced, sharpened by repetition, "and I had to let go of anything that slowed me down, including her." There was a murmur of agreement, a few sympathetic nods, the kind reserved for men who framed their past as sacrifice rather than destruction, and somewhere at the edge of the room, just beyond the soft halo of chandelier light, Evelyn Carter stood still, unnoticed by most, yet fully aware of every word. She wore a simple navy dress, understated to the point of invisibility among the sea of couture and diamonds, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture calm, almost too calm for someone listening to her life being reduced to a convenient anecdote. No one approached her, no one asked her version, because Daniel had already given them a story they preferred, clean, decisive, flattering to the one telling it. And stories, once repeated enough, had a way of becoming truth. A waiter passed by with a silver tray, offering champagne she didn't take, the faint scent of citrus and glass polish trailing behind him as she shifted her gaze slightly, not toward Daniel, but toward the reflection of him in the mirrored wall behind the bar, a habit she had learned long ago, to observe without being seen observing. 5 weeks, she thought, not with urgency, not with anger, but with the quiet precision of someone measuring time against something larger than memory. 5 weeks since the first article had been drafted, since the first signature had been placed on a document no one in this room had read, since the narrative that Daniel controlled had begun, very slowly, to fracture beneath the surface. He lifted his glass slightly, as if to punctuate his own story. "She didn't understand the vision," he added, a faint smile touching his lips. "Some people just aren't built for success." Laughter followed, light and effortless, the kind that cost nothing to give and everything to receive, and Evelyn felt it pass through the room without touching her, like wind through an open window. She turned her head just enough to catch a glimpse of the television again, the anchor now moving on to another segment, another story, but the words lingered, suspended somewhere between coincidence and inevitability, and for the briefest moment, one of the investors near Daniel glanced toward her, not recognizing her fully, but sensing something he couldn't quite place, a flicker of awareness that didn't yet have a name. Evelyn's expression didn't change, not a smile, not a frown, just a stillness that felt deliberate, controlled, as if she had already stepped beyond this room, beyond this version of herself, into something no one here was prepared to see. Daniel continued speaking, confident, certain, unaware that the narrative he had built so carefully was no longer his alone, unaware that somewhere beyond the velvet ropes and polished marble, beyond the curated image and borrowed admiration, the world was beginning to ask a different question, one that didn't belong to him anymore. And when it finally had an answer, it wouldn't be quiet. The laughter did not follow her when she stepped away, and that was how Evelyn preferred it, quiet exits, unobserved movements, the subtle art of disappearing from rooms that had once defined her. The hallway beyond the ballroom was cooler, lined with tall mirrors and muted gold sconces that cast a softer, more forgiving light, and for a moment she paused, not to collect herself, but to listen, to the distant echo of voices, to the rhythm of heels against marble, to the faint vibration of her phone tucked neatly into her clutch. It buzzed once, then again. Not urgent, not frantic, but precise, like everything else in her life had become. She did not check it immediately. Instead, she looked at her reflection, really looked this time, not as the woman they remembered, not as the version Daniel had described, but as something quieter, steadier, a presence that did not need to announce itself to be felt. 5 years ago, she would have adjusted her posture, softened her expression, rehearsed a smile that fit the room she was about to re-enter. Tonight, she did none of those things. The phone buzzed again, and this time she opened it, her thumb moving with calm familiarity as a series of notifications filled the screen, names she did not recognize, publications she had never spoken to, headlines still forming in real time. She did not read them fully, not yet, but one line caught her attention, not because of its drama, but because of its accuracy. Sources confirm a silent stakeholder behind Brooks Strategic Holdings. She exhaled slowly, not relief, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement, like watching a piece fall into place exactly where it was meant to. Down the hall, a pair of men in tailored suits spoke in low voices, their conversation drifting just enough for her to catch fragments. "It does not make sense," one of them said. "The deal was solid, everything was approved, and then suddenly the funding disappeared." The other shook his head. "Someone higher up pulled it, someone with leverage we did not see." Evelyn closed her phone gently, the screen going dark as if nothing had happened, as if the world outside that ballroom was not already shifting beneath Daniel's feet. She continued walking, her steps unhurried, measured, the soft sound of her heels echoing against the polished floor in a rhythm that felt almost like a metronome, steady, controlled, inevitable. A server passed by carrying a tray of sparkling water, and this time she took a glass, the cool condensation against her fingertips grounding her in the present moment, a small, deliberate choice in a night that was anything but accidental. She took a sip, the crisp taste sharp and clean, and for a brief second her mind flickered back, not to the pain, but to the pattern, the way Daniel used to speak for her, over her, around her, shaping every conversation until her voice became unnecessary, until silence felt easier. Then correction. That silence had been mistaken for absence, for weakness, for nothing. It had been the foundation of his story. But silence, she had learned, was not empty. It was space. And in that space, she had built something no one had thought to look for. At the far end of the hallway, the doors to a private lounge stood slightly ajar, a soft glow spilling out onto the carpet, and inside, a small group gathered around a large screen, their attention fixed, their expressions tense in a way that did not belong to celebration. Evelyn did not enter, she did not need to, because she already knew what they were seeing, the early ripples of a narrative correcting itself, data aligning with truth, influence revealing its source. Behind her, the faint swell of music from the ballroom rose again, followed by another burst of laughter, Daniel's voice threading through it with the same easy confidence, the same certainty that had carried him this far. He still believed the story was his to tell. Evelyn turned slightly, just enough to glance back down the hallway, not at him directly, but at the doorway that framed the life he thought he controlled, and for the first time that night, something almost imperceptible shifted in her expression, not a smile, not quite, but the quiet recognition of timing, of sequence, of the moment before everything becomes visible. Then she turned away completely, the glass still in her hand, her phone silent now, and walked forward, leaving the echo of his voice behind her as the world he had built began, piece by piece, to answer to someone else. Inside the private lounge, the air felt different, heavier, as if the polished calm of the ballroom could not quite reach this space where conversations were no longer decorative but precise, and decisions carried consequences that could not be softened by laughter or champagne. A large screen glowed against the far wall, its cool blue light reflecting off glass tables and tailored suits, illuminating faces that had begun to lose their practiced ease, replaced now with something sharper, more attentive. Numbers scrolled across the display, lines of data intersecting with headlines that were still forming, still being shaped by sources that understood the weight of timing. One man leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "This does not align with the last quarter projections," he said quietly, as though lowering his voice might change the outcome. "There is a controlling interest we did not account for." Another adjusted his glasses, scanning the report again. "It is not new," he replied, his tone measured. "It has been there for months, layered through subsidiaries, private acquisitions, quiet transfers that did not trigger attention because no one was looking in the right direction." The room fell into a brief, charged silence, the kind that exists just before realization becomes unavoidable. Evelyn remained just outside the threshold, unseen, her presence unannounced, yet the subtle shift in the room felt familiar, almost expected, like watching a pattern reveal itself after years of being ignored. She did not need to hear every detail to understand what they were uncovering, because she had built it piece by piece, transaction by transaction, each decision made in silence, each move designed not for recognition, but for position. 5 years ago, she had signed papers in a different room, one far less elegant, where the lighting had been too bright and the voices too confident, where Daniel's legal team had spoken over her with practiced certainty, reducing her role to something incidental, something replaceable. She had not argued then. She had not raised her voice or corrected their assumptions. She had simply listened, memorizing the structure of what they believed, understanding not just what they took, but how they took it. That had been the moment everything shifted, though no one in that room had noticed. A soft chime broke the silence in the lounge as an email notification appeared on the screen, and one of the men reached for the remote, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before opening it. The message expanded, a formal statement from a financial oversight board, confirming what the data had begun to suggest, that a majority stakeholder existed within Brooks Strategic Holdings, one whose identity had remained undisclosed due to the legal framework of the acquisitions. "Who is it?" someone asked, not loudly, but with a tension that cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice. No one answered immediately, because the answer was not yet fully visible, not yet confirmed in a way that could be spoken without consequence. Evelyn turned away before the name appeared, not out of avoidance, but because she understood timing in a way they did not, because revelation was not a single moment but a sequence, and this was only the beginning. Back in the ballroom, the music had shifted to something slower, smoother, the kind of melody designed to fill space rather than command attention, and Daniel stood near the center, still surrounded, still speaking, though his posture had changed in ways only the most observant would notice, a slight tightening in his shoulders, a brief glance toward the exit as his phone vibrated against the table beside him. He picked it up with casual confidence, the same ease he had carried all evening, but as he read the first line, something flickered behind his expression, not fear, not yet, but uncertainty, a disruption in the narrative he had repeated so often it had become part of him. Across the room, a few conversations began to shift, subtle at first, a glance exchanged, a question left unfinished, the kind of quiet movement that precedes something larger. Evelyn stepped back into the corridor, the distant echo of the ballroom wrapping around her like a memory she no longer belonged to, her reflection passing briefly in the mirrored wall before disappearing again into the soft, controlled light. She did not rush, she did not hesitate, she simply moved forward, because she knew something Daniel did not, that the story he had told about her was not ending, it was being rewritten, not by her voice, not by confrontation, but by something far more powerful, the truth aligning itself in full view, one detail at a time, until there was no space left for anything else. Daniel read the message twice, not because he did not understand it, but because his mind refused to accept the simplicity of what it implied, that something fundamental had shifted without his awareness, that control had slipped not in a dramatic collapse but in a quiet, almost invisible recalibration. Around him, the room had not changed, not visibly, the same warm lighting, the same low music, the same carefully curated laughter that rose and fell in practiced waves, yet the rhythm felt off, just slightly, like a conversation missing its expected response. He lowered his phone slowly, his expression composed, but his eyes sharper now, scanning faces not for admiration but for confirmation, searching for any sign that someone else had seen what he had just read. A man across from him cleared his throat, his earlier ease replaced by something more cautious. "Everything all right, Daniel?" he asked, the question light on the surface but weighted underneath. Daniel gave a short nod, a controlled smile returning to his lips as if it had never left. "Just business," he replied, dismissive, effortless, the same tone he had used countless times before, but the words felt thinner now, less certain even to his own ears. Another vibration pulsed through the phone in his hand, then another, a series of notifications stacking faster than he could ignore them, and this time he did not wait. He turned slightly, angling his body away from the group as he opened the messages, each one adding a layer to the same unfolding reality, analysts requesting clarification, partners asking questions that did not exist an hour ago, a board member sending a single line that carried more weight than any paragraph, "We need to talk immediately." He exhaled quietly, steadying himself, the kind of breath that came from years of managing perception, of never allowing uncertainty to show, but beneath that control something else stirred, not panic, not yet, but the recognition of a variable he had not accounted for. Across the ballroom, conversations began to fracture in subtle ways, not breaking entirely, but bending, shifting direction as phones appeared in hands, as glances were exchanged that lingered a second too long, as names were spoken more carefully, as if testing their relevance in a changing context. Near the bar, two women leaned closer together, their voices low but urgent. "Did you see this?" one whispered, tilting her screen just enough for the other to catch a glimpse, a headline forming in real time, incomplete but suggestive, unknown stakeholder linked to Brooks Holdings. The other frowned. "That cannot be right, Daniel owns that company," she said, but her tone lacked conviction, already adjusting to the possibility that what they believed might not hold. Daniel felt it before he fully saw it, the shift in attention, the subtle redirection of focus that no amount of confidence could entirely command once it began, and for the first time that evening, he was no longer the center of certainty, but the subject of quiet speculation. He moved toward the bar with measured steps, each one deliberate, refusing to rush, refusing to signal urgency, because urgency invited questions, and questions were the one thing he could not yet answer. He placed his glass down, the faint sound of crystal against marble sharper than it should have been, and looked up at the mirrored wall, catching his own reflection in the same frame he had occupied earlier, but something in it felt different, not outwardly, not to anyone else, but to him, a slight misalignment between the image he projected and the reality beginning to form around him. Somewhere beyond the ballroom, beyond the conversations and the speculation, beyond the glow of screens and the quiet rise of headlines, Evelyn continued forward without pause, her presence moving through spaces that did not require her announcement, her steps guided not by reaction but by intention. She did not need to see Daniel now to understand what was happening, because she had already lived the moment where everything changed, and unlike him, she had prepared for it long before it arrived. Back inside, Daniel's phone vibrated again, and this time when he looked down, the message was shorter, clearer, a direct statement that left no room for interpretation. Majority ownership confirmed. Identity pending release. He stared at the words for a fraction longer than necessary, the edges of his control tightening, not breaking, but no longer effortless, and as he lifted his gaze once more, the room did not feel like his anymore, not in the way it had just minutes ago, because something unseen had entered the space, something that did not announce itself with noise or spectacle, but with quiet, undeniable authority. And it was only a matter of time before everyone would know exactly who it belonged to. The first headline appeared without ceremony, sliding quietly into existence on a financial news ticker that most of the room had ignored until now, a thin strip of white text against a muted background, but the words carried a weight that cut through conversation more effectively than any raised voice ever could. Majority stake in Brooks Strategic Holdings linked to previously undisclosed entity, and within seconds, screens across the ballroom began to mirror it, phones lighting up in hands that moments ago had been holding champagne, attention shifting not in a sudden wave but in a series of small, synchronized movements, like a room collectively turning toward something it did not yet understand. Daniel saw it in reflections before he saw it directly, in the mirrored panels behind the bar, in the subtle change of posture from the people closest to him, in the way conversations paused mid-sentence and then resumed with a different tone, more cautious, more deliberate. He did not move immediately. He stood still, allowing the information to settle, calculating, adjusting, the way he always had when faced with unexpected variables, but this was different, because the variable was not external, it was embedded, something that had been inside his structure long enough to become invisible. His phone vibrated again, and this time when he looked, the message was no longer a question or a request, it was a confirmation forwarded from a contact he trusted, a document attached, official, precise, the kind of language that left no room for interpretation, outlining ownership percentages, led entities, and at the center of it all, a name that had not yet been spoken aloud in the room, but would be soon enough. He closed the screen before reading further, not out of denial, but because he understood something instinctively, that once he saw it fully, there would be no returning to the version of the evening he had been living just minutes ago. Across the room, the shift became more visible, a cluster forming near the television as the segment expanded, analysts now speaking in measured tones, explaining implications, discussing influence, asking the question that had begun to circulate through the room in quieter forms, who was behind it? A woman near the edge of the crowd glanced toward Daniel, her expression polite but altered, curiosity replacing admiration, and then she looked away, not dismissing him, but repositioning him in a narrative that was no longer entirely his. He felt it in the space around him, the subtle widening, the way people no longer leaned in quite as closely, the way their attention split between him and the screens, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same story. He set his glass aside completely now, the gesture small but final, his hands free, his posture straightening not out of confidence but out of necessity, a physical response to something internal tightening, focusing. For years, he had understood leverage as something you applied outward, something you used to shape outcomes, to influence decisions, to control direction, but what he had never considered, not fully, was what it felt like to be on the receiving end of something equally controlled, equally intentional, but entirely unseen until the moment it revealed itself. Near the entrance, a staff member adjusted the volume of the television slightly higher, not enough to disrupt the room, but enough for fragments of the report to become audible. Sources indicate the stakeholder has maintained a low profile, operating through indirect channels, and strategic positioning suggests long-term planning rather than recent acquisition. Each phrase landed with quiet precision, building a picture that did not rely on speculation, but on structure, on decisions made long before tonight. Daniel's gaze shifted again, not searching for validation now, but for pattern, for any sign of where this had begun, how it had developed without intersecting his awareness, and for the first time, a memory surfaced uninvited, not dramatic, not obvious, but small, almost insignificant at the time, a signature on a document, a clause he had skimmed past, a name he had not considered important enough to examine closely. The realization did not arrive as a shock, but as a slow, unmistakable alignment, pieces connecting in a way that left no space for dismissal. Somewhere beyond the immediate circle of attention, beyond the glow of screens and the tightening of conversations, Evelyn moved through another corridor, her presence untouched by the rising tension behind her, her pace unchanged, because she understood what they were only beginning to see, that this was not a sudden shift, not an unexpected takeover, but the inevitable outcome of something built with patience, with precision, with silence. Back in the ballroom, the headline updated again, expanding, clarifying, and this time when the room read it, there was no mistaking the direction it pointed, only the final detail remained unspoken, the identity still withheld, hanging in the air like a held breath, and as Daniel stood at the center of it all, no longer fully in control of the narrative he had once commanded, the room itself seemed to wait, not for him to speak, but for the truth to arrive in full, because everyone could feel it now. Something had shifted beyond perception, beyond reputation, into something far more definitive, and when it was finally named, there would be no question left about who truly held the power. The room did not erupt, it did not descend into chaos or noise, because the kind of power shifting beneath the surface was not loud, it was precise, and the people in that ballroom were trained to recognize precision before they reacted to it. Instead, the atmosphere tightened, conversations lowering in volume but increasing in intensity, every word chosen more carefully now, every glance carrying more weight than before. Daniel remained where he stood, but the space around him had changed in a way that could not be measured in feet or distance. It was something less tangible, a subtle withdrawal of certainty, as if the invisible framework that had once supported his presence in the room was quietly being dismantled piece by piece. He looked again at his phone, this time opening the document fully, forcing himself to read through the structure he had once believed he understood completely, line by line, entity by entity, each layer revealing not randomness, but design, a pattern that had been constructed with intention so deliberate it bordered on invisible. It was not rushed, not reactive, not the work of someone trying to take something from him in a moment of opportunity. It was the work of someone who had been there all along, building quietly within the same system he had dominated, learning its weaknesses, its blind spots, its assumptions. A faint sound drew his attention, the television now clearer, the volume adjusted just enough that the analyst's voice carried across the room in calm, authoritative tones. What we are seeing here is not a hostile takeover in the traditional sense, but rather a long-term consolidation of influence, executed through strategic acquisitions that were never publicly connected. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because he understood that language, he had used it himself, had built his reputation on that exact approach, and now he was hearing it described from the outside, applied to something he had not seen coming. Across the ballroom, more guests had gathered near the screens, their earlier detachment replaced by focused attention, and with each passing second, the narrative continued to evolve, moving away from speculation and toward confirmation. There is speculation that the controlling party may have had prior direct access to Brooks' strategic holdings, another voice added, which would explain the level of insight required to execute this kind of positioning. That line lingered in the air longer than the others, because it carried implication, because it pointed not just to strategy, but to proximity, to someone who had once been close enough to understand everything without needing to be told. Daniel's grip on his phone tightened slightly before he consciously relaxed it, placing it back on the table beside him, because he knew that if he held onto it too long, if he stared at it too openly, the room would see something he was not ready to show. He lifted his gaze again, scanning the faces around him, but now he was not looking for admiration or agreement, he was looking for alignment, for confirmation of what they were beginning to suspect, and he found it in small ways, in the hesitation before someone spoke to him, in the way a question was redirected rather than asked directly, in the subtle recalibration of how they positioned themselves in relation to him. Not rejection, not yet, but distance, the first quiet step away from certainty. Near the entrance, a man in a dark suit stepped aside to take a call, his voice low but urgent. "Yes, I see it, we need to verify immediately, find out who is behind this before it becomes official." The phrase, "before it becomes official," echoed in Daniel's mind, because he knew exactly what it meant, that there was still a moment, however brief, before the final detail was confirmed, before the identity was no longer a question but a fact. And in that narrow space of time, he felt something unfamiliar, not fear, but anticipation edged with something colder, the awareness that whatever name would be revealed next was not going to be neutral, not going to be distant or unknown. It was going to be personal. Beyond the ballroom, in a quieter wing of the hotel where the noise softened into a distant hum, Evelyn stepped into an elevator, the doors closing smoothly behind her with a muted chime, sealing her off from the shifting atmosphere she had already set into motion. The mirrored walls reflected her from every angle, not multiplying her presence, but reinforcing it, a calm, centered figure standing at the intersection of everything that had led to this moment. She glanced once at her phone, not to check for updates, but to confirm something already expected, a single message waiting at the top of the screen, simple and precise, "Ready when you are." She did not respond immediately. Instead, she slipped the phone back into her clutch, her expression unchanged, because she understood that timing was not about speed, it was about sequence, about allowing each piece to fall into place before revealing the final one. Back in the ballroom, the analyst's voice continued, steady and composed, and while the identity of the majority stakeholder has not yet been officially disclosed, sources indicate that the individual has maintained a direct historical connection to the company's inner structure. This time, the room did not just listen, it reacted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, the collective realization beginning to take shape, narrowing the possibilities, eliminating the distant, the unrelated, leaving only those who had once been close enough to know everything. Daniel did not move, but something inside him shifted, the last layer of assumption giving way to something far more precise, because in that moment, he no longer needed confirmation to understand the direction this was heading. He already knew. And the only thing left was for the world to say her name. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that barely registered against the quiet hum of the upper floor, a stark contrast to the shifting energy below, and Evelyn stepped out into a corridor that felt removed from the noise, as though the building itself had layers, each one holding a different version of reality. The carpet beneath her heels softened her steps, absorbing sound, creating a silence that was not empty but deliberate, the kind that allowed thoughts to settle without interruption. At the end of the hallway, a set of double doors stood closed, polished wood reflecting the ambient light in muted tones, and beside them, a discreet brass plaque with no name, no indication of what lay beyond, only the quiet suggestion of privacy. She paused for a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, the kind that comes when every movement has already been considered long before it is made. Behind those doors, the next step waited, not a reaction, not an escalation, but a continuation of something that had been in motion for years. Downstairs, the tension had reached a point where it could no longer remain unspoken, and the room that once revolved around Daniel now felt divided, not physically, but in perception, as if two versions of the same story were colliding and only one could remain. The television screen shifted again, the graphics updating with sharper clarity, the language tightening, moving away from speculation and into confirmation, and this time the analyst's voice carried a subtle change, not louder, not more dramatic, but more certain. "We are now receiving verified reports that the controlling interest is held by an individual with direct historical ties to Brooks Strategic Holdings, someone who was previously part of its internal structure." A ripple moved through the room, quiet but unmistakable, as conversation stopped mid-sentence and attention converged, no longer scattered, no longer hesitant. Daniel stood still, his posture unchanged, but his stillness was no longer the same as before. It was no longer effortless, it was deliberate, controlled, as though every movement now required calculation. He did not look at the screen immediately. Instead, he looked at the people around him, watching the shift in their expressions, the way recognition began to form not all at once, but in stages, a glance, a pause, a subtle narrowing of possibility. Someone near the front spoke under their breath, the words not meant for him, but not hidden either. It has to be someone close, someone who knew everything. Another voice followed, quieter but clearer, there are not many people who fit that. The implication settled into the space between them, not yet spoken aloud, but no longer distant. Daniel's gaze finally lifted to the screen, the light reflecting in his eyes as the report continued, each word narrowing the distance between assumption and certainty, and for a brief moment, something from the past surfaced, not a memory he had chosen to revisit, but one that arrived uninvited, precise and undeniable. A conference room, years ago, sunlight cutting through glass walls, papers spread across a table, and Evelyn sitting across from him, not speaking much, but watching, always watching, her silence something he had once dismissed as passivity, something he had mistaken for absence of understanding. He remembered how easily he had explained things around her, how naturally he had assumed she would not question the structure, the decisions, the mechanisms behind what he was building. He had believed that control meant being the one who spoke the most, who decided the direction, who defined the narrative. He had never considered that someone could learn everything simply by listening. Back in the present, the analyst's voice continued, and sources indicate that this individual's involvement dates back several years, suggesting a long-term strategic position rather than a recent acquisition. This time, there was no mistaking the shift in the room, no uncertainty left to soften the realization. The distance between Daniel and the people around him widened, not physically, but perceptibly, as if an invisible line had been drawn, separating what they thought they knew from what they were beginning to understand. His phone vibrated again, but he did not look at it. He did not need to. The pattern was complete now, the sequence fully aligned, and there was only one name that fit the shape of what was unfolding. Upstairs, Evelyn reached for the door handle, her fingers resting lightly against the cool metal, and in that brief moment before she turned it, everything that had led here existed in perfect stillness, not chaotic, not rushed, but precise. Each decision led upon the last until the outcome was no longer a possibility, but an inevitability. She opened the door without hesitation, stepping into the room beyond, leaving the quiet corridor behind her, while below, in the ballroom where certainty had once belonged to someone else, the final piece of the narrative moved into place, and the only thing left was for the world to say her name out loud. The room beyond the doors was quiet in a way that felt intentional, not empty, but insulated, as though it existed outside the rhythm of the evening below, and the moment Evelyn stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted to meet her presence without announcement or surprise. A long table stretched across the center, its surface clean, uncluttered except for a series of neatly arranged documents and a single screen displaying data that mirrored what was now unfolding downstairs. Only here it was not speculation or interpretation, it was structure, precise and complete. A man in a charcoal suit looked up as she entered, his expression composed, respectful, not deferential but aligned, the way one recognizes authority without needing it to be declared. "Everything is in position," he said, his voice low, measured, as if the outcome had never been in doubt, only the timing. Evelyn nodded once, setting her glass down on the table without looking at it, her attention already on the screen, her gaze steady as she scanned the figures not to confirm them, but to acknowledge what they represented, years of decisions condensed into a single visible moment. And downstairs, the man continued, glancing briefly at his own tablet, the narrative is shifting exactly as expected. Evelyn allowed a small pause before responding, not because she needed to think, but because she understood the weight of pacing, not shifting, she said quietly, her voice calm, even, correcting. The word settled into the room with quiet certainty, not dramatic, not emphasized, but final in its clarity. Downstairs, the correction had begun to take form in ways that could no longer be contained within private conversations or discreet glances, the television now displaying a more detailed report, graphics updating in real time as the analysis moved from possibility to identification, and this time, the tone of the broadcast had changed in a way that even the least attentive guest could feel. "We are now able to confirm," the anchor said, her voice steady, professional, carrying the weight of verified information, that the majority stakeholder in Brooks Strategic Holdings is not an external entity, but an individual with direct and personal ties to the company's past leadership. The words echoed across the ballroom, not loudly, but with a clarity that cut through every remaining conversation, drawing attention not in fragments now, but in full. Daniel stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the screen, his expression controlled but no longer effortless, because the distance between implication and confirmation had collapsed into something immediate, something unavoidable. Around him, the room had fully reoriented, not abandoning him, but no longer revolving around him either, attention now anchored to the unfolding revelation rather than the man who had once defined it. A name had not yet been spoken, but it was no longer absent, it existed in the space between every thought, every glance, every unasked question. Near the edge of the crowd, someone whispered it, barely audible, testing the shape of it before it became official. "Evelyn, could it be?" The uncertainty in the question did not weaken it, it sharpened it, because even in doubt, the possibility felt aligned with everything they were now seeing. Back upstairs, Evelyn reached for one of the documents, not to read it in full, but to trace the final line where ownership percentages converged, her name printed in clean, precise type, not bolded, not emphasized, because it did not need to be. She had never needed her name to be loud, only accurate. The man across from her shifted slightly, waiting, not for instruction, but for confirmation of what came next. She placed the document back down exactly where it had been, her movements unhurried, deliberate, and then she picked up her phone, unlocking it with a simple motion, her thumb hovering over the message she had received earlier. For a brief moment, everything existed in perfect alignment, the room below holding its breath, the narrative above fully formed, and the final step resting in the space between action and intention. She typed a single word, not long, not elaborate, just enough to move the sequence forward, and then she sent it without hesitation. Downstairs, the broadcast paused for a fraction of a second before continuing, the anchor receiving new information through her earpiece, her expression shifting ever so slightly as she prepared to speak again. "We can now confirm the identity of the majority stakeholder," she said, and this time, there was no hesitation, no ambiguity left to soften the impact. "Evelyn Carter." The name settled into the room with a weight that could not be dismissed or reinterpreted, and for a moment, everything else faded, the music, the conversation, the careful balance of perception that had defined the evening until now. All eyes moved, not by instruction, but by instinct, searching for her, for the woman who had just been placed at the center of a narrative no longer controlled by the man who had once claimed it. Daniel did not move immediately. He did not speak. He simply stood there, the name echoing in a space that had once belonged entirely to him, and in that silence, the shift was complete, not loud, not explosive, but absolute. Upstairs, Evelyn lowered her phone, her expression unchanged, her presence as steady as it had been from the beginning, because for her, nothing had shifted at all, it had only become visible. For a moment, no one moved, not because they did not understand what had just been said, but because understanding had arrived all at once, too complete to react to immediately, and the name lingered in the air with a clarity that did not require repetition. Evelyn Carter. It was no longer a possibility, no longer a quiet assumption passed between lowered voices, it was a fact, confirmed, anchored, impossible to reshape. The room adjusted around it in real time, conversations dissolving into silence, attention redirecting not outward now, but inward, each person recalibrating what they thought they knew, where they stood, and what it meant to be in the presence of a truth that had existed long before it was spoken aloud. Daniel remained where he was, but the stillness that held him now was different, no longer the composed control of someone managing perception, but the measured restraint of someone processing something irreversible. His gaze did not search the room anymore, because there was nothing left to find there, only reflections of the same realization echoing back at him from every angle. Instead, his mind moved backward, not in confusion, but in precision, tracing the pattern he had missed, the moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, the quiet decisions that had never demanded his attention. He saw it now in fragments that aligned too cleanly to ignore, the meetings where Evelyn had said very little, the documents she had reviewed without comment, the accounts he had assumed were secondary, the transfers that had passed through layers he never questioned because they did not disrupt his immediate control. He had believed visibility equaled importance, that what was not seen could not shape the outcome, and in that assumption, he had given her exactly what she needed: space, time, and access. Across the room, someone finally spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough to break the silence. She was there the whole time. The statement did not accuse, it did not challenge, it simply acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement, the narrative shifted completely, from surprise to understanding. Others began to follow, not with disbelief, but with recognition, piecing together what had always been present but never prioritized. She handled the internal reports. One said quietly, she knew the structure better than anyone. Another added, he trusted her access. The word trusted hung in the air longer than the others, not as praise, but as context, as the missing element that explained how something so precise could have developed without resistance. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but enough to ground him in the present, because what had been revealed was not chaos, it was design, and design required intention. He lifted his head slightly, not to reclaim attention, but to face it, because avoiding it would only confirm what the room already understood. For years, he had believed that control meant shaping the story before anyone else could question it, that if he defined Evelyn as nothing, the world would accept it without needing proof. And for a long time, it had. But now, the absence he had assigned to her had become the foundation of something far more powerful, something that did not rely on perception, only on structure. Near the television, the broadcast continued, expanding on the implications, outlining the extent of the holdings, the influence attached to them, the decisions that would now fall under her authority, and with each detail, the room adjusted again, not dramatically, but definitively, shifting its center away from where it had once been anchored. Upstairs, Evelyn stood at the table, her attention no longer on the screen, because there was nothing left there she did not already know. Instead, she looked out through the floor-to-ceiling window that framed the city beyond, light stretching into the distance in clean, orderly lines, each one part of a larger system that functioned without needing to announce itself. The man beside her spoke again, his tone respectful, measured. The transition is complete. Evelyn did not respond immediately. She allowed the words to settle, not as a conclusion, but as a confirmation of something that had been true long before tonight. When she finally spoke, her voice remained steady, unchanged. It was always complete, she said quietly, her gaze still fixed on the city, they just could not see it yet. Back downstairs, Daniel stood in a room that no longer belonged to him in the way it once had, surrounded by people who were no longer looking at him for direction, but for understanding, and in that shift, something fundamental had been redefined, not through confrontation, not through noise, but through the quiet, undeniable presence of truth, revealed at exactly the moment it could no longer be ignored. The shift did not reverse, it did not hesitate, it continued forward with a quiet certainty that made it impossible to deny, and as the realization settled deeper into the room, something else followed, something more subtle but far more decisive, the redistribution of attention, of respect, of power. Daniel felt it in the way people now approached him, not with the easy confidence of before, but with a measured distance, as if recalculating where he stood in relation to the truth that had just been revealed. No one challenged him directly, no one confronted him with accusations or questions, because they did not need to. The facts had already done that with far greater precision than any words could. A man who had been standing near him earlier now offered a polite nod before stepping away, his attention redirected toward the screen, toward the unfolding implications that no longer required Daniel's interpretation. Across the room, conversations resumed, but they had changed in tone, no longer centered around him, no longer orbiting his narrative, but expanding outward, discussing what this meant for the company, for the future, for the balance of influence that had just been redefined. Daniel remained still for a moment longer before finally moving, not abruptly, not defensively, but with a controlled purpose, as though he were stepping into a role he had not rehearsed. He walked toward the edge of the room where the light softened slightly, where the reflections in the glass were less defined, and for the first time that evening, he allowed himself a moment not of performance, but of recognition. He had not lost everything, not in the dramatic sense, but he had lost something far more specific, the certainty that he alone shaped the outcome. That certainty had been replaced, not by chaos, but by structure that did not belong to him. His phone remained silent now, the earlier flood of messages replaced by something more calculated, responses waiting, decisions forming, the kind that would require him to engage not as the sole authority, but as one part of a larger equation. He understood that shift immediately, not emotionally, but strategically, because this was the language he knew best, and now he was being spoken to in it. Upstairs, Evelyn turned away from the window, the city lights no longer holding her attention, because what mattered was not the view, but the movement beneath it, the systems that connected everything, the quiet networks that determined direction long before it became visible. The man across from her watched carefully, not waiting for instruction, but observing the subtle cues that defined her approach, the absence of urgency, the lack of reaction, the complete alignment between what had been built and what was now revealed. "They are adjusting," he said, glancing briefly at his tablet. "The board will request a formal statement soon." Evelyn considered that for a moment, not weighing options, but confirming sequence. "Let them," she replied, her tone calm, unhurried. "They will not be asking for clarification, they will be asking for direction." The distinction was small in language, but absolute in meaning, and it settled into the room with the same quiet authority that had defined everything she had done. Downstairs, Daniel looked up again, his gaze no longer searching for validation, but for alignment, and this time, when he met the eyes of those around him, he saw something different, not dismissal, not judgment, but acknowledgement of a new reality that neither of them could ignore. He was no longer the only one who understood how the system worked, and that realization did not diminish him, but it redefined him, placing him in a position he had never occupied before, one where he would have to respond rather than dictate. Near the television, the broadcast shifted again, analysts now discussing the implications of Evelyn's position, her potential influence over future decisions, her role not as an outsider, but as a central figure in the company's direction. Her name was no longer an interruption in the narrative, it was the foundation of it. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing not because the situation had improved, but because it had clarified, and clarity, even when it shifted control, was something he understood how to work with. Upstairs, Evelyn reached for her glass again, the cool surface grounding in its simplicity, and for a brief moment, everything aligned exactly as it had been intended, not as a victory, not as a defeat, but as a correction, precise and complete. And in that quiet alignment, the story that had once been told about her no longer mattered, because the only thing left was what could be proven, and that was something no one in that building could deny anymore. The request came sooner than anyone expected, not through whispers or side conversations, but formally, directly, delivered with the kind of clarity that left no room for delay, and when it arrived, it did not feel like a reaction, it felt like an acknowledgement of something that had already been decided. Downstairs, one of the senior board members stepped forward, his posture composed, his expression carefully neutral as he approached Daniel, not with confrontation, but with intention. "We need to move forward with a statement," he said quietly, his voice low enough to remain private, yet firm enough to carry weight, "and we need alignment." The word alignment lingered between them, precise and deliberate, because it no longer referred to Daniel alone, it referred to a structure that now extended beyond him. Daniel met his gaze, holding it for a moment longer than necessary, not in defiance, but in calculation, recognizing immediately what was being asked, not just cooperation, but acknowledgement of a shift that could not be reversed. He nodded once, slowly, not agreeing yet, but accepting the direction of the conversation, because resistance at this point would not restore control, it would only highlight its absence. Around them, the room continued to adjust, not dramatically, but definitively, as conversations took on new focus, as names were spoken with greater care, as the presence of Evelyn Carter was no longer an abstract concept, but an active force shaping the direction of everything unfolding. Upstairs, Evelyn stood at the table, her attention now returning to the documents, not because she needed to review them, but because each detail represented a step that had been taken deliberately, each line a confirmation of a decision that had never required external validation. The man across from her glanced at his tablet again, then back at her. "The board is requesting a joint statement," he said, his tone steady. "They want to present a unified position." Evelyn considered that briefly, not weighing options, but confirming sequence once more. "Of course they do," she replied, her voice calm, almost quiet, as if the outcome had been obvious from the beginning. "They are not reacting to me, they are reacting to certainty." She reached for her phone again, not hurried, not delayed, and as she unlocked it, the screen filled with messages that all carried the same underlying tone, not confusion, not panic, but recalibration, the language of people adjusting to a new center of gravity. One message stood out, not because of its urgency, but because of its simplicity, a direct request from the board, asking for her presence, for her input, for her direction. She read it once, then set the phone down again without responding immediately, because timing was still hers to control, not theirs. Downstairs, Daniel felt the weight of that same timing, not as something external, but as something that now included him rather than revolved around him. He understood what the board member had implied, that the statement would not be complete without her, that whatever narrative they presented would need to reflect a reality that had already shifted beyond his singular authority. He exhaled quietly, his posture relaxing slightly, not in defeat, but in adaptation, because this was no longer about maintaining an image, it was about navigating a structure that had changed in ways he could not ignore. He glanced once toward the elevator, not expecting to see her, but acknowledging the distance between where she was and where he stood, a distance not measured in floors, but in position, in influence, in control. The television continued to broadcast, analysts now discussing not just the revelation, but the implications of her role moving forward, her potential to reshape decisions, to redirect strategy, to influence outcomes that had once belonged entirely to him. Her name was no longer introduced, it was assumed, integrated into every discussion as a central point of reference. Upstairs, Evelyn finally picked up her phone again, her expression unchanged, her movement steady, and this time she responded, not with explanation, not with negotiation, but with a single line that carried the weight of everything that had been built: "I will join when it is necessary." She sent it without hesitation, because necessity was no longer defined by urgency, it was defined by alignment, and she understood that better than anyone in that building. Downstairs, the board member's phone buzzed softly in his hand, and as he read the message, his expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, because the response was exactly what the moment required, nothing more, nothing less. He looked back at Daniel, meeting his gaze once again, and this time, there was no ambiguity left between them, only the quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be decided in this room alone. And in that understanding, the final layer of control that Daniel had once held without question settled into something new, something shared, something defined not by who spoke the loudest, but by who had already built the outcome long before anyone else realized it was possible. By the time the elevator doors opened again, the silence in the upper corridor felt different, no longer suspended, but resolved, as if the moment that had been building for years had finally chosen its direction and would not be altered. Evelyn stepped inside without hesitation, her reflection briefly captured in the mirrored walls before the doors closed behind her, carrying her downward not with urgency, but with quiet inevitability. Each floor passed with a soft mechanical hum, a steady descent that mirrored the shift already completed below, and she stood still, composed, her hands resting lightly at her sides, not preparing, not rehearsing, because there was nothing left to prepare for. The outcome had already taken shape long before this moment. Downstairs, the ballroom no longer resembled the space it had been at the start of the evening, not in its design, not in its lighting, but in its center of gravity. Conversations had thinned into focused exchanges, clusters forming and dissolving with a purpose that no longer revolved around performance, but around alignment, around understanding what came next. Daniel stood near the edge of the room now, no longer surrounded, but not isolated either, positioned in a space that reflected his new role within the structure, still relevant, still present, but no longer singular. When the elevator doors opened and she stepped into the room, the shift was not announced. There was no sudden silence, no dramatic turn, but something moved through the space with quiet precision, an awareness that spread not through sound, but through recognition. One person noticed first, then another, until attention began to redirect, not abruptly, but in a slow, collective motion that required no instruction. Evelyn walked forward with measured steps, her pace unhurried, her presence neither demanding nor diminishing, simply existing in a way that made everything else adjust around it. She did not scan the room, she did not search for reactions, because she already understood them, and understanding did not require confirmation. Daniel saw her before she reached him, not because she called attention to herself, but because her presence aligned too precisely with everything that had just been revealed to be ignored. For a brief moment, their eyes met, not in confrontation, not in accusation, but in recognition, a silent acknowledgement of a reality that neither of them could change. He did not speak immediately, and neither did she. The space between them held more clarity than any words could have provided. Around them, the room continued to shift, conversations pausing as people recalibrated, not intruding, but observing. Aware that whatever passed between them would define more than just the moment. Daniel straightened slightly, not out of defensiveness, but out of respect for the clarity that now existed between them, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of the effortless confidence that had once defined it, but not weakened, only adjusted. "You built this," he said, not as a question, but as a statement that had taken too long to reach him. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment before responding, her expression unchanged, her voice calm, steady. "No," she said quietly, "it was always there." The distinction was subtle, but it carried the weight of everything that had been misunderstood, because what she had done was not create something from nothing, it was reveal what had been ignored, structured what had been overlooked, and positioned herself within it long before anyone thought to look. Daniel absorbed the words without interruption, because he understood them, not emotionally, but structurally, recognizing the truth in a way that did not require agreement. Around them, the room remained still, not frozen, but attentive, as if aware that the moment did not belong to spectacle, but to precision. A board member stepped forward slightly, his presence measured, respectful. "We are ready," he said, his voice directed toward both of them now, no longer separating authority, but aligning it. Evelyn gave a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, and without another word, she stepped past Daniel, not dismissing him, not avoiding him, but moving forward into the space that now required her presence. He turned slightly to follow, not out of obligation, but because he understood that whatever came next would not be defined by who spoke first, but by who had already shaped the outcome. And as they moved together toward the center of the room, the narrative that had once belonged to one of them settled into something far more complete, not contested, not divided, but aligned with a truth that no longer needed to be proven, only recognized. The statement was delivered without spectacle, without raised voices or carefully staged emphasis, because by the time Evelyn stood at the center of the room, there was nothing left to prove, only something to confirm. The board member spoke first, outlining the transition in calm, measured language, each word chosen not to persuade, but to align, to formalize what had already been understood, and when Evelyn spoke, she did not contradict, she did not elaborate, she simply clarified, her voice steady, precise, carrying just enough to reach those who needed to hear it. "This is not a change," she said, her gaze moving across the room without lingering, "it is a recognition." The distinction settled quietly, but completely, because it removed the illusion of suddenness, reframing everything that had happened not as disruption, but as inevitability. Daniel stood beside her, not overshadowed, not diminished, but repositioned, his presence no longer the defining force, but part of a larger structure that he now understood from a different angle. He did not interrupt, he did not challenge, because there was nothing in her words that required correction, only acceptance of a truth that had revealed itself with undeniable precision. Around them, the room absorbed the moment not with applause, not with reaction, but with adjustment, subtle and immediate, conversations reforming around a new center, attention settling where it naturally aligned. A few steps away, a journalist lowered her phone after capturing the exchange, her expression thoughtful, already shaping the narrative that would leave this room and move into the world beyond it, a narrative no longer driven by assumption, but by fact. Evelyn did not linger in the spotlight that formed around her, she did not hold the room longer than necessary, because power, as she had learned, did not require duration, only clarity. When the board member finished, when the final confirmations were spoken, she stepped back slightly, not retreating, but creating space, allowing the structure to hold without her needing to reinforce it. Daniel turned his head just enough to look at her again, not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging, and for the first time, there was no attempt to redefine her, no effort to reshape what the world now saw, only a quiet understanding that the narrative he had once controlled had never been complete. "You did not need to say anything," he said, his voice low, almost reflective, as if the realization had settled into him fully, "you just let it become true." Evelyn's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her gaze, something softer, not in emotion, but in clarity. "It was always true," she replied, her tone calm, unwavering, "they just needed time to see it." The words did not challenge him, They did not accuse, they simply existed, like everything else she had built, grounded in structure rather than perception. He nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition, because he understood now that what he had dismissed as silence had never been emptiness, it had been space, and in that space, she had built something he had never thought to look for. The room began to move again, not away from her, but forward, conversation shifting into planning, into alignment, into the next phase that would unfold beyond this night. And as the energy redistributed itself, Evelyn stepped away from the center without drawing attention to the movement, her presence no longer needing to anchor the moment because the moment itself had already settled. She walked toward the exit with the same measured pace she had carried from the beginning, her reflection passing once more through the mirrored walls, unchanged, steady, complete. Behind her, the room continued, the narrative now fully formed, no longer fragmented, no longer controlled by a single voice, but defined by a truth that had revealed itself in full. Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, watching not her departure, but the space she left behind, a space that no longer required her to be filled, because everything she had built remained, structured, undeniable, and entirely beyond reinterpretation. And as the doors closed quietly behind her, the final shift settled into place, not as an ending, but as something far more lasting, a reality that did not need to announce itself again, because once seen, it could never be unseen. He had once believed the story ended when he said it did, but now, standing in a room that no longer belonged to his version of events, he understood something far more precise. The story had never been his to finish, only hers to reveal.